75 members of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives have written this letter to President Biden, the letter that Suhasini just referred to, saying that President Biden should raise with Prime Minister Modi areas of concern such as press and religious freedoms in India and the country's human rights record. And what is interesting is that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan didn't shy away from commenting on this issue. He, in fact, has said on record that President Biden will raise U.S. concerns about democratic backsliding in India. However, he will not lecture Prime Minister Modi on the subject. He said, when we see challenges to press, religious or other freedoms, we make our views known. So it'll be interesting how this comes up in these talks. So Hasani, stay on with us. Let me get a word in from Professor Scott Lucas at this point. Professor Lucas, if I could ask you to step back and look at the big picture, what we are witnessing right now, many would say, is a moment in history. This state visit by Prime Minister Modi to the United States is being described as a historic one that is likely to redefine the India-U.S. relationship. President Biden has already said it is going to be the defining partnership of the 21st century. How do you look at the significance of this visit?
I think in terms of the symbolism, it is historic. I mean, you'll have not only the visit with President Biden, but this is an official state visit in which Prime Minister Modi will address the joint session of U.S. Congress. That's an honor that's given to very few foreign leaders. But in the broader sense, the thing about our times these days is that history keeps being more and more historic each year. Now, this is a key moment, but it is a moment where we're in, let's put it this way, in transition to what might be even greater developments. China has been mentioned, and I think China is significant here. I think you're in the midst of the United States probably trying to realign to a position of competition, not confrontation with China. You don't want a military showdown over Taiwan. You don't want a military showdown over the South China Sea. But in economic and technological competition, you would like India to be working with not only the U.S. economy, but other international economies as China tries to develop its alternative. But even as important as China has been, I think the catalyst that has been missed by a lot of the press here in Europe and indeed in the U.S. has been Ukraine. You might remember that if we had this conversation just a year ago, there was real tension in the U.S.-Indian relationship because the U.S. feared that India would be drawing too close to Moscow, not just a question of not condemning the invasion of Ukraine, but of taking this vast amount of discounted Russian oil. On the other hand, India was concerned that the United States was going to try to bully it into a position of opposition to the Russians. Now that disappeared. That tension disappeared. Why? Because India and the U.S. really came to an agreement on the rules of the game. And that is, okay, India can take a neutral position publicly. The Americans are fine with that. They just don't want Delhi to tilt towards support of the Russians. The Indian government recognizes that. And this visit really consolidates this, that at this pivotal moment over Ukraine, where a Ukrainian counteroffensive is likely, but over months, not over weeks, but over months, to defeat the Russians inside Ukraine and cause great problems for the future of Vladimir Putin, you need India to be alongside and cooperating with the international community, for example, humanitarian support for Ukrainian recovery, even if India will never come out and directly condemn Putin's invasion.
That is interesting. So, Hasani, I would like to ask you this question, final question before we let you go. It is well established that India and the United States do not see eye to eye on the Ukraine war and Russia's role in it. Whether it was India's refusal to condemn Russia for its invasion or the fact that India insisted on continuing to import Russian oil. But would it be correct to say that the United States has, in a sense, made its peace with the fact that India is a very strong and important partner, but is not and will not be an ally? India insists on asserting its strategic autonomy. That is not going to change. Therefore, no point expecting monogamy.
I think it is very clear, you put it very well, Neha, that the U.S. has backed down on its decision. About a year ago, we heard a lot of very strong statements coming from the U.S. Officials saying there will be consequences for those who help Russia. We hope that India will not buy more Russian oil, and that pleading or sort of certainly asking India publicly to change its vote at the United Nations. India did none of those. In fact, from less than 1% of its oil supplies from Russia last year, today India takes about 40% of its oil supplies from Russia. And I think the US has decided that there is no point in pushing when they are not able to get the results that they desire out of it. And it seems more pragmatic to back down on the issue of the UN, or on the issue of India taking a stand, or on the issue of even India inviting the Ukrainian president to address the G20 this year, or the subject of Russian oil. But there is some, I suspect, happiness in American corridors, that the idea that Russia's resources are getting more and more drained into this Ukraine war will mean that India is already, by force, if not by choice, having to start looking at its options for defense dependence on Russia at a time like this. While neither side will say this publicly, the fact is that if the war in Ukraine continues and Russia needs to divert all of its military resources there, it will be more and more difficult to supply India. We already know that many of the big ticket items, including the S-400 defense systems, are delayed when it comes to supplying to India. So the fact is, regardless of why, whether it is a necessity or a virtue, India is having to reduce its dependence on the Russia relationship for that, in which case the US is, of course, one possible option for India to look at. And there are others. Prime Minister Modi is going to France in a few weeks, expected to announce big ticket defense hardware purchases there as well. But you're right that America has clearly made its peace on this occasion. Remember, it's not always been the case. In 2017, 2018, I remember when President Trump had issued dire threats to anyone continuing their ties with Iran. India had backed down at that point, and the Modi government had decided to cancel all oil and gas purchases from Iran since then. And Iran was India's biggest supplier at a certain time of very cost-effective crude. So the fact is that in this case, I think you're right on the Russia issue. The US has decided to basically work with what it can, and is comfortable with the fact that that the situation as it pans out is perhaps also bringing India and the US closer at assessing what they can do together.
Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar, your thoughts on this big visit, the history that we're witnessing now right in front of our eyes, that ceremonial welcome on the South Lawns of Prime Minister, on the South Lawns of the White House for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, his first ever state visit to the United States. A lot seems to be riding on this visit. President Biden himself has said today that the India-US relationship is going to be the defining partnership of the 21st century. How significant is this visit according to you?
Well, I think it's very significant, Neha. First of all, thank you for having me on your show. I think it's very significant. I think it's going to be transformational. In fact, it brings to mind, I remember I used to be in Washington at that time. Times were just about changing. 2005, when we signed the US-India civil nuclear deal. And just before that, we had the visit of Condoleezza Rice to India. And she had come back and she had said that, the United States would like to see India as a major global power. So I think here also it is that inflection point that I can see, that United States would like to do everything to make India into a much more significant power than it already is. It's about $3.5 trillion economy, going to be the 5th largest economy, now going to be the 3rd largest economy, et cetera, et cetera. But in a variety of ways, whether it is semiconductors, whether it is transfer of technology, whether it is defense supplies, I remember, in July 2005, we had signed the first defense agreement with the United States. And today, the United States has emerged as possibly the second or the third largest supplier of defense equipment. And now today, we are talking not only in terms of the supply, but also transfer of technology. And of course, you could ask that, similar promises were made, similar discussions were held in 2013-14 when we signed the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative. But I think times are very different today than they were in 2013-14. I think expectations on both sides were quite different. So coming back to your question and wrapping up my response, I think this is a truly significant visit, truly consequential visit. And the contours are already available. And I think it's going to do a great deal to catapult the relations into the next orbit.
It is going to do a great deal to catapult the relationship into the next orbit. Well, that certainly is the hope that most people have. The expectations from this visit are extremely high. Ambassador Sajjanhar says that this is an inflection point in the India-US relationship. Professor Lucas, let me come back to you at this point. One of the primary reasons why people believe that this is indeed an inflection point for this bilateral relationship is not only because Prime Minister Modi is on his first state visit to the US, or the fact that he's only the third world leader who has been invited by the Biden administration for a state visit to the US. But the primary reason is, the transfer of technology that we're now likely to witness as part of the GE F414 fighter jet engine deal. That is what is truly path-breaking because, as has been pointed out by many, America's refusal to part with sensitive technology and share it with India in the past has been a very thorny issue. Once this deal goes through, it will be a thing of the past. And in fact, there are those who've pointed out that the US has never gone this far, sharing this kind of technology with a non-ally. And this reflects just how significant the United States believes this relationship is today.
Ambassador noted we had been on that path with the 2005 and the 2013 agreements. But I think, again, we come back to what is the catalyst here in 2023. And that is, as you've talked about in your discussion earlier, India has historically relied upon Russia for much of its defense equipment and its defense technology. Not just the United States, but other countries such as France, which Prime Minister Modi will be visiting, want to bring India away from that relationship with Russia, precisely because of the Ukraine conflict, and bring it into cooperating with the West. And so the General Electric Agreement to provide these jet engines is important, as is the reports that the United States will begin providing military drones, naval military drones to India. But in addition, to take it beyond the military, realize that we're not just talking about a bilateral relationship. We're talking about the US and India within important regional and global dynamics. This is a 21st century global economy, which is rapidly developing in terms of technology, but that poses both opportunities and challenges. In addition, we face the challenges such as climate change, such as the post-pandemic question about adequate health care, such as the question of economic inequality. And when you look at this, if you focus too closely just on being, quote, anti-China or anti-Russia, you miss those big issues. So I think you're going to see the United States talking to India, and you're going to see India talking to the United States, but you need to think about who else they are talking to over these next few years. If indeed we finally get a coherent Asian approach. And I have to be honest with you, that as important as this visit is, and as significant as it is, there can be other shocks that can unsettle it. So for example, if there's a renewal of conflict between India and Pakistan, what does that do? Does that unsettle the relationship? If the Chinese and the Pakistanis increase pressure on the line of control, what does that do? And so while focusing on how important this week is, this is only the start of an ongoing process, both on specific issues and on wider developments in the region.
All right. Ambassador Sajjanhar, let me ask you this question. Yes, during this visit, it is the bilateral relationship between the two countries which is in focus, and therefore it is bilateral issues that are going to take center stage. However, I don't think anybody can shy away from the fact that Russia and China are significant factors in this visit and in this India US relationship. To what extent do you think we should be looking at this new chapter in the India US relationship through the prism of China and Russia?
Okay, both of them very important entities, as far as, discussions are concerned. As far as China is concerned, we see what the situation is. What the External Affairs Minister has also said that the situation is abnormal. As far as the border is concerned, there is huge military deployment on the Chinese side, and it is, we want status quo ante of April 2020. That apparently doesn't seem to be happening because you would recall that we had Wang Yi when he was the foreign minister of China. He'd come to India last year in March. He said everything is normal on the border. We need to sort of, get back to business as usual. Then we had the Chinese ambassador Sun Weidong. He also went. He also said the same thing. And twice when we had the visit of Xin Gang, the new Chinese foreign minister, he also made this similar noises that we need to put the relationship, put the situation on the border in the right perspective, etc. But India is very concerned as to what the situation on the border is, and it doesn't appear that China is taking India's concern very seriously. So if I were to look at the situation right now, I think India has concerns with China. United States also has very significant concerns with China, not only in the economic and technological field, but also as far as the issue of Taiwan and South China Sea is concerned. So I think in that context, and if the United States is not willing to decouple, it is at least willing to de-risk. And in that context, it will try to see that, many of the supply chains will come to India, meaning in terms, it'll be a China plus sort of a policy, not, movement of any of this or any fresh investments coming in. And that, as much as they can come to India, that will be good. And in that context, I think it is the push to semiconductor manufacture in India, chip manufacture, and many of the other areas, whether it is green energy, climate change, 4G, 5G, artificial intelligence, and all the other areas, space, cybersecurity, etc. So I think there we will definitely see much greater energy. And of course, we've spoken about the G414 and, some of the other technologies in the defense sector. So I can foresee that that should definitely go along, on more or less expected lines. There might be a few hiccups here and there. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, Neha, that also is a very important relationship for us on two accounts. I'll not put on energy at the moment because that is, that's not going to last forever. That's not going to last for very long. So two issues are, one is how Russia is used by India to balance China in some way or the other. So it doesn't want to spoil its relations. And then, of course, in terms of the supply of the defense equipment. Now, in both these accounts, I feel that the utility of Russia will continue to come down with the passage of time. And, India will be forced to look more and more closely at the United States to enhance its relationship. Meaning, what is it that India is looking for at the moment? India today is looking for, in terms of growth of its economy, becoming a stronger global economic player. And who can help India in that context? It is only America. China can, of course, will not do it. Russia also neither has the capital nor has the technology. And we, meaning the United States today is India's largest trading partner, $192 billion. And of course, both the countries have been talking about taking it to $500 billion. That might be by 2025, that might be an aspirational figure, but definitely that is out there, and both the sides will strive to get to it. But, there is much investment that is taking place, both sides, from US to India and from India to US. So I think in that context, and you look at the sort of relations that Prime Minister Modi has developed with President Joe Biden, not only what is happening today, what we are seeing in Washington, D.C., but you look at the last few months, whether both the leaders meet in Hiroshima on the sidelines of G7 or on the sidelines of the Quad, or you may see them meeting on the sidelines of the G20 Bali summit last year in November, or in COP26 in Glasgow, or in G7 in Elmau in Germany. The body language and the comfort level and the rapport that the two leaders enjoy, and the frequency with which they meet, Neha, I think that tells you what is the importance that both leaders attach to this relationship. As compared to that, you see how often Prime Minister Modi has interacted or met Putin. Only once in Samarkand last year. And even this time, when there was a possibility for the SCO summit, that has also been turned virtual. So
And
there'll be
even
no
when he did
possibility.
meet President Putin, his words of advice were, this is not an era of war.
Yes, you're right. So, let me, this has become rather long. I didn't want it to be so long, but, you asked these two important questions, and I think it is fair to deal with them at some length, because they are important issues that we will continue to grapple with as we go forward. So the final point here is, I think there is much more, I think with the passage of time, India will continue to grow increasingly closer to the United States, because that is what, today, it is not only the value systems that both the leaders spoke about on the, South Lawns of the White House, but it is also interests, and interests are also very wide-ranging. You did mention that President Biden said that it is, I don't know whether he said it is a defining partnership or the defining partnership, but even when Barack Obama had come to India in 2010 in August, if I remember correctly, then he had also mentioned that the India U.S. relationship is going to be a defining partnership of the 21st century. And of course, President Biden, in his conversation with Prime Minister Modi last year in May 2022 on the sidelines of the Quad Summit in Tokyo, he had said that I would like to see the relationship between these two countries as the best in the world. So I think these are strong words, and even Prime Minister Modi had said that he looks upon this as a partnership of trust. So from both sides, I think the statements have been rather, high on the sentiments. And of course, we'll need to see how the discussions today, help to take them forward.
Absolutely. There is no doubt that a lot of importance is being attached to this visit. President Biden has said that this is going to be a defining relationship of the 21st century. But as they say, God is in the details. So we'll have to wait and see, once these bilateral talks are over, what kind of details emerge. The joint statement that's issued, we'll have to wait and see what's announced. But of course, clearly, there are some big ticket deals that are on the cards. One announcement has already been made. Many more announcements are expected in the course of the next few hours. We'll get into those specifics in a moment. But Professor Lucas, let me come back to you at this point. And since we have dwelt, in some detail on the issues of Russia and China, let me ask you this about China. Fact of the matter is that in the current geopolitical scenario, what's happening is that you have these two global poles, the United States and China, whose economies are intertwined. This is not like the Cold War era. This is not like the United States and Soviet Union of yore. But at the same time, there is this great power rivalry. There are some who believe that that is exactly where the sweet spot for India lies. Do you agree with that? And how do you think India can leverage it best?
I'm sorry, but I don't think you should ever start from the standpoint that you try to exploit conflict because you can risk getting burned by that conflict as it spreads. And we saw that happen to a lot of countries in the Cold War who thought maybe they could play off the Soviet Union against the United States. I think instead the profit, and this is what you're seeing, I think, from this visit today, is in saying, all right, how can we benefit without a situation where conflict escalates? So to give you a couple of examples, I think as we've talked about here, the question of where Asia goes forward in a way which is not one where you have open conflict between China and India or between China and other Asian states, where if China wants to develop its own economic system, fair enough, but that India has the space to pursue its own economic autonomy. That's what you're really talking about here when you talk about issues like AI, like technology, like transport, like manufacturing, even on the issue of visas, to allow professional individuals to be able to move more freely. But let me add a second dimension to this, and that is one of the other problems with trying to say, oh, we'll lever the great power competition between China and the United States is there are other players here. So for example, consider the European Union. One reason why China has backed away from support of Moscow over the Ukraine conflict, and one reason why I think it is backing away to an extent from the threats over Taiwan, is because they need this investment deal with Europe, which has been stalled for years. And so therefore, the Chinese are making more and more approaches to Europe to say, look, we don't have to fight, we can cooperate. Well, similarly, India can value that relationship with the United States, but when you've got the European Union as this important economic bloc, then you see, for example, the Modi visit to France, and there will be visits to other European countries, which is how do we benefit from a situation which does not end in conflict? Now, again, there can be all types of tensions that suddenly flare up. There can be regional tensions. There can be tensions on India's borders. There can even be a flare up of domestic tensions inside India. But the whole point is to try to avoid those tensions from getting in the way of the progress that you seek. That's what today will be a symbol of. Now, does it actually play out where you get not only the military cooperation, but the economic and the social cooperation, not only between India and the United States, but involving other countries, where the sweet spot is that everybody benefits? It's not a win-lose situation, but a win-win situation.
I agree with you. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Diplomacy is never a zero-sum game. And I think India has always made it abundantly clear, and this was pointed out by Suhasini earlier, that it does not want to get caught in this great power rivalry. Let me go back to Ambassador Sajjanhar at this point. Ambassador Sajjanhar, what we know so far is that GE and Hindustan Aeronautics Limited have already signed an MOU for what is being described as a game-changing, deal for the joint manufacture of fighter jet engines in India. And what makes this game-changing is the fact that there's going to be transfer of technology at this level for the very first time between India and the United States. Apart from that, it is widely expected that the $3.5 billion Predator drone deal will go through. Then Prime Minister Modi himself has invited semiconductor major Micron to come to India and invest in setting up a manufacturing unit here. That deal is likely to be announced. In fact, the Indian cabinet has already cleared a 22,000 crore rupee proposal in that direction. We're told that India is going to join the Artemis Accords. That is, of course, a US-led effort to send humans back to the moon by 2025. And we are given to understand that new H-1B visa processing changes are going to be announced and the two countries are going to set up new consulates. Those are some of the details that we have picked up so far. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens at the end of these talks, especially when that joint statement is issued. But really, as far as the big ticket items and the key takeaways are concerned, what are your expectations?
I think, Neha, basically on lines similar to what you have said, basically in terms of the transfer of technology for the GF414 jet engines and so on and so forth. You are very right, that these discussions have been going on for quite some time. But I think and there have been sort of, some doubts that have been expressed that, whether if it didn't happen earlier, if it didn't happen last time, what is the guarantee, what is the surety that it is going to happen this time? And I think there are a number of reasons for that. India has sort of, signed all these foundational agreements. India has been designated as a major defense partner by the United States. India has also been, put into the category of STA 1, Strategic Trade Authorization 1 category, which is a very special category, and very few countries are part of that, so that very many approvals from the Congress or other agencies are not required before transferring sensitive technology and so on and so forth. So I am quite hopeful. Basically, the way I look at it is that all these agreements and arrangements that you mentioned, whether it is this transfer of technology for the jet engines, or transfer of drones to India, the Predator drones, or semiconductor, or AI, or 5G, 6G, or green energy, or space, etc. I think all those are win-win solutions, win-win positions for both the United States and India, because India wants to become, maintain its strategic autonomy, of course, and wants to become stronger, both in terms of its defense capabilities, as also a stronger economic power, get more of the supply chains that are currently being controlled by China. And that is also in the interest of the United States. And the United States, as whatever little I was able to overhear, from your earlier discussion, United States has also realized that a stronger, a more confident India will be in a position, without a conflict taking place between either the United States or China, or India and China. It will be in a much better position, much stronger position to deter China from taking any sort of, adventurous move against Taiwan, or in the South China Sea. At least it will serve as a strong deterrent. So it is going to be in the interest of both the countries to work together to make India into a much stronger and a more self-confident power. So I would, go with what your thinking is, what you have been able to find out so far as to what the outcome is going to be. But I think there are going to be more details that will become available as we go along. But what
Right.
I'm really looking forward to also, meaning the last comment I'll make here, is to listen to the address by the Prime Minister to the joint session of the US Congress, because I think that's going to be, he'll try to lay out the direction of the future of the relationship between the two countries. I was thinking that he might give some indication in his brief address at the White House, but he decided not to do that. I think he possibly wanted to save all the firepower for,
You're right,
figuratively.
because many felt that President Biden's statement on the South lawns of the White House was far more detailed. Prime Minister Modi's
Very true, very true.
statement was brief, and probably you're right, that has to do with the fact that he is going to deliver that historic address to a joint session of the US Congress, the first Indian leader to do that twice. Last time, of course, he did it back in 2016, and parallels have also been drawn with how very few world leaders have actually had the honor to do this, leaders including Nelson Mandela and Winston Churchill. Professor Scott Lucas, before we let you go, I want to ask you a quick question about this entire issue of transfer of technology, because it is so critical. number one, to India's armed forces, and two, to the future of this bilateral relationship. For a decade, talks in a sense was stalled, didn't go anywhere, but now finally this breakthrough has been achieved. It's being called a game changer. The fact that America, it's being said, has never shared this kind of sensitive technology with a non-ally in the past. It describes it as the crown jewel of its defense capabilities. How significant do you think this is for what is being described as an inflection point in the India-US relationship? The fact that we are going to finally address and get rid of this thorny issue and have transfer of technology between the two countries.
I think you know the answer to that. I think this is part of that inflection point that the ambassador is talking about. It's important in terms of the specifics to which you could use the technology, to which you could use military technology, which we've referred to already in terms of aerial power, in terms of naval power. It's important in terms of transfer of technology, in terms of what you can do in terms of developing your economy. It is important when you talk about the area of cyber and where we go both with cyber opportunities and cyber defense. But there's a broader importance to the transfer of technology, which is it builds up institutional relationships. One of the big differences between the US and India and the US and other powers has simply been that, for example, we've had NATO since 1949. So when it comes to issues of security around the transfer of technology, when it comes to protocols for how technology is used, you're talking about almost 75 years where the United States has had institutional experience with other militaries, with other diplomatic services around those issues. And even though the US and India, in some respects, for example, between their diplomatic services, have worked closely together, you haven't really had the institutional foundation that you've had with NATO or that you've had with other US European organizations. Now you're beginning to build that up. You had the potential in 2005 and in the 2013 agreements, but now you're going to get specific agreements over the transfer of technology. And what's important is what the protocols are, how the militaries cooperate over this, how the diplomatic services cooperate over this, and how the economic agencies cooperate over it. So in a sense, while we're focusing, quite rightly, on Modi and Biden today, the longer term issue will be, because presidents can change, prime ministers can change, it'll be the institutional relationships that are built up between Delhi and Washington, which are linked to transfer of technology, that will have lasting significance.